Hi everyone, I'm just going to leave it for another minute or so just to let people come in, and then we'll start. So hi everyone, my name is Brendan and I'll be your host for this evening's webinar. I would like to start by thanking everyone for joining us tonight for tonight's webinar on autism and mental health, which is part of our community supports webinars kindly supported by SuperValu. We will hear from two speakers tonight, firstly from Amy Pearsons, a senior lecturer in psychology from the University of Sunderland, and secondly from Gillian Fagan from AcoraTherapy. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to pop them into the Q&A box and I will try to answer them after the presentations. Tonight's webinar will be recorded up until the Q&A section and then uploaded to the AsIAm YouTube channel in the coming days. There are also live transcripts turned on. If people wish to turn these subtitles off, they can just click on the CC live transcript button to turn them off. So I'll hand it over to Amy now.
Thanks, Brendan. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming this evening. It's really nice to see so many people here. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. I've got some slides to support the talk, and hopefully everyone can see that okay. So I'm going to be talking about understanding determinants of mental health outcomes for autistic people and talking a little bit about some of the research we've been doing around victimization and masking, and how that helps us understand the kind of support we might need in recovery for better mental health. Oh. And there we go. I just wanted to start off by making a little bit of a note on vulnerability here right at the start. Often when we talk about things like negative mental health outcomes for autistic people, what we hear is that autistic people are particularly vulnerable to poor mental health. But vulnerability is not an innate or inherent characteristic of a particular person or group, and anybody can be situationally vulnerable due to a fluctuation in personal circumstances, which might lead to a marginalized social status. What this means is that any of us might experience things across our lifetime, like social isolation or underemployment, that might lead us to become socially excluded, and that is related to vulnerability. It isn't a characteristic of ourselves. And autistic people, because they constitute a minority group, they are more likely to experience this kind of social exclusion and therefore the associated vulnerability alongside that. But there is some evidence to suggest that issues in understanding people of a different neurotype might present additional barriers to spotting things like manipulative behavior. So many autistic people would self-identify as having difficulty with spotting nefarious intentions or manipulative behavior from others. And this might be explained through some of the difficulties we have picking up on social signals from non-autistic people, but this can go for within neurotype interactions as well. So sometimes autistic people might find it difficult to pick up on manipulative behaviors from other autistic people. So with that being said, we know that autistic young people and adults are more likely to experience mental health difficulties and poor mental health outcomes. So autistic people are more likely to experience things like anxiety and depression than non-autistic people. But we know they're also more likely to experience things like PTSD and trauma. And we know that these outcomes are related to the chronic stress that autistic people experience as a result of being part of a minority group. So Monique Botha found that poor outcomes for mental health for autistic adults were related to what we call minority stressors. So things like expectations of social rejection, engaging in things like masking and concealment, and that these are primarily driven by stigma. So stigma is the process by which we label a particular person, an individual, or a group as inferior or what we call discreditable. So someone we might not take as seriously due to things like undesired differentness. And this differentness is something that autistic people experience. We're frequently othered by people for not fitting in with kind of assumed societal norms. So autistic people experience stigma at the group level related to people's negative perceptions of autism, the kind of negative stereotypes they might have about autistic people lacking empathy or being poor communicators, for instance, tend to lead to more stigma related to autistic people. But autistic people also experience stigma as an individual for failing to meet normative expectations. So many of us are labeled as weird or, you know, kind of pointed out, especially in younger years at school, as not fitting in. And that means we're experiencing stigma both in terms of the label we might have to describe ourselves, but also in terms of how other people perceive us. And stigma results in a range of really negative outcomes, including things like victimization, which I'm going to focus on in this talk, but it's also related to experiences of masking and concealment. So suppressing aspects of your identity and keeping them from other people in order to pass either as non-autistic or as more socially palatable in social interactions. That might be suppressing things like stimming, not wanting other people to see that. It might be through forcing yourself to make eye contact with someone if it makes you uncomfortable, or it might be through using non-native social strategies. So using things like memory to try and remember facts about people when you're having a conversation, so that you can show that you've been listening and engaging with what that person's saying. So having to draw upon more resource in order to interact. Also a heightened experience of social rejection and peer victimization and bullying, an internalization of negative beliefs that other people hold about us. So with that, what we mean is when someone says something negative, either about ourselves or about autistic people as a whole, we take that negative belief and we internalize that into our self-concept. We integrate it into how we think of ourselves. So if you hear people frequently say things like, well, autistic people have social difficulties, they're not very good communicators, then you might start to think, oh, I'm not a very good communicator. The way in which I try to socialize with people is problematic, instead of looking at that as a bit of a bi-directional relationship between you and your skills and how other people perceive and also respond to that. So how does this relate to victimization? As I've said, stigma predicts a higher likelihood of a range of negative life events, including victimization. We know that autistic people are more likely to experience peer victimization in childhood, what's frequently referred to as bullying from their peers, but that they're also more likely to experience what we call interpersonal victimization. Interpersonal victimization is abuse and victimization that comes from people that we know, from familiar others. So this can include things like friends, family members, partners, and interpersonal victimization, because of that broad nature, can span out a wide range of relationships. Some of the most commonly investigated forms of interpersonal victimization are things like mate crime. It's a very kind of term specific to the UK, but it's used to refer to victimization that occurs within friendships and is often targeted at disabled people. And we think that perpetrators often draw upon situational vulnerabilities in order to try and manipulate and take advantage of people. This can include things like financial exploitation, and that might start off what we think of as fairly low level, like, you know, asking someone to buy you a coffee when you go out saying you forgot your wallet, and then kind of making larger and larger demands. So expecting that person to pay every time they go out, and then, oh, I need to pay this bill, can I borrow money off you, and never giving it back. So it starts off fairly low level, but quite insidious, and then might go into larger and larger demands, putting that person who they're asking in a really uncomfortable position. There might be threats of violence associated with that. So, you know, if you don't give me that, I'm going to hurt you. Or if you were a good friend, you would do X, Y, Z. We also know that sexual exploitation is quite a common form of interpersonal victimization, whether that be through things like intimate violence or, you know, a kind of high level of things like sexual trafficking. And exposure to interpersonal victimization is related to higher instances of PTSD in autistic adults. So some recent evidence that suggests that autistic people might be more likely to experience PTSD for a range of what we call kind of non-PTSD diagnosable events. So based on the kind of the manual that they often use to diagnose people with PTSD, we think that autistic people might experience PTSD through a range of other events that aren't included in that manual, which includes things like bullying. Recent research is starting to suggest that actually some of the things that are labeled as bullying might be quite high-level forms of victimization, which are leading to these increased instances of PTSD and mental health difficulties. So what kind of impact does this have on autistic people? Well, some recent research that I've been doing with Kieran Rose and my colleagues Sam Forster and John Rees at the University of Sunderland, we have been asking autistic adults about their experiences of interpersonal victimization, what kinds of things have helped them recover, and what kind of barriers have there been to accessing support. And we found that autistic people often felt like they expected to be victimized by other people, so that victimization was quite normal, and often blame themselves for, people who've been told that they didn't fit in or that they were weird. They thought they must have done something in order to deserve it. We also heard that they felt like they didn't fit in, and that had also led alongside the victimization to the masking and then extreme exhaustion that had been associated with that, so then burning out. It took people a really long time to realize what had happened to them was abuse and to make sense of their experiences, and that it was really difficult to access support. I'm going to talk about each of those findings in a little bit more detail now. So a lot of the people we spoke to had experienced what we call polyvictimization. So it wasn't just one instance of victimization. So it wasn't that someone had said, okay, well, I had a friend who, exploited me for money, but it was that they might have had a friend who'd exploited them for money, and another friend who'd been physically violent, and a partner who'd been abusive. So it was repeated instances of victimization across the lifespan. And this had led people to think that what they're experiencing was very normal, because if everyone's treating me this way, then this must be like a normal thing that people like me experience, and that they must have done something to deserve that treatment, so that there must have been something about them that had caused people to treat them like this. And it's really important that we're able to recognize that experiencing abuse in any relationship isn't a normal thing. But in order to recognize that, we also need to be able to recognize what abuse is. So if you suspect that someone is treating you in an unfair or really unpleasant way, it's important to trust your intuition and not ignore that. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in relation to masking in the coming slides. But what this means is that we also need to start talking to people about their experiences and ensure that they have someone safe to speak to. And this is true for both autistic and non-autistic young people, but it means that we need to talk to people about what good, healthy relationships look like, and about what negative things might be to look out for, so what we might term as red flags within relationships. It's also really important that we're able to work out what has happened to us and how we might feel about that. So a lot of us really struggle to identify our own emotional state, called alexithymia. So recognizing bodily sensations and being able to put labels to them. Some of us struggle with the labeling of the sensation, and some of us struggle with kind of not feeling the sensation at all, or not being able to recognize that we feel the sensation. But this is something that a lot of autistic people find difficult, and this can result in difficulties when you are dealing with things like therapy. So if someone asks you, how do you feel about this? And you're not really sure, you haven't worked that out yet. It can be quite difficult sometimes to process what's happened, or to help you to realize that something bad has impact on how we feel. So if you don't necessarily identify that inner state after something has happened to you, you wouldn't necessarily realize how much of an impact it's had. So you're like, okay, I'm all right, I'll just keep going. And then after quite a prolonged period of time, when you've had the time and space to process that, it can have a really negative impact and lead people to experiencing mental health difficulties, anxiety and stress. So you need to recognize that the ability to, what we say, correctly identify feelings, and I have correctly in inverted commas, because your feelings are your own, they're subjective. There's no kind of right way to experience a particular event, and no right response to have to things like abuse or negative life events. But for a lot of us who don't know how to recognize what's going on inside of us, it can be quite difficult to understand how to process things. And a lot of us might not understand that other people don't experience that until we start to talk about it. And this can impact on us finding the right words to describe what's happened to us. So accessing the language to describe our experiences can make all the difference in your own understanding of what has happened to you. And that's true for both realizing what has happened to you might have been abuse, but also can relate to things like understanding that you're autistic. So spending a long time not knowing that the way in your experience in the world is different from other people and what that means. And being able to put these things together and find the right terminology can really help us understand our experiences and start to unpack those, make sense of them. We also know that when we're dealing with stressful situations and we're engaging in things like masking, that might further impact on us being able to find the right words and process what's going on, because you're used to kind of pushing things down and ignoring them. You can't regulate stress if you can't recognize it. It's really difficult to find things to help you deal with unpleasant situations if you can't even recognize that it's causing a negative reaction in you. So we might need different strategies to start linking our events and kind of thoughts and feelings about that together. Things like keeping diaries, keeping notes about your experiences, and then using that to make sense of things can be really helpful. And finally, we asked people what kind of support they wanted to see. So for people who had experienced victimization, what was it that had made them seek out help if they hadn't? And if they hadn't, what had prevented them from help? What had formed a barrier? And what were the things that were good when they had looked for help? So we found that structural inequalities prevented people either from leaving bad situations. So that might have been things like not having enough money to move out of a home you were sharing with someone who's being abusive, or being socially isolated, not having friends to help you. That prevented people from getting out of abusive situations in the first place. But it also prevented people from seeking or receiving help. So people we spoke to said, you know, they weren't taken seriously by the police if they did speak to them. They were forced to make eye contact. They weren't believed about their experiences. Or that a lot of therapists people spoke to didn't have a very good understanding of autism and autistic people. They might hold quite a lot of stereotypes about how autistic people respond to things, about empathy, about things like memory, and that would impact on the kind of the therapeutic experience that the person who was seeking help had, which is not great. We also recommended that it was really important that we start really early in teaching young people about what bullying and abuse looks like, and what to do if it was happening to you. So who you could go and talk to, who you could tell if something was happening, and be taken seriously about that. Because a lot of the people we'd spoken to said that they were blamed. You know, well, you know, if you change the way you act, other people might not respond to you in that way. It has really had a further negative impact on them. And people really highlighted the importance of autistic people having spaces to spend time together and form communities with other autistic people, where there could be validation and understanding of their experiences within an environment that wasn't propagating further stigma. So people weren't coming up with these kind of really negative ideas about autistic people, but autistic people had a space in which to flourish and interact with each other. So this is a really nice quote from one of our participants, Luna, and Luna says, I would like to see community-based support, like support groups with other autistic people where we can relate to each other, validate each other, and figure out ways to face the world together. Because I don't believe victimization ends for us. It's kind of ongoing thing in a neurotypical world. The idea that trauma is just one event you can recover from and one day feel safe again is not really relevant when the world is not built for you, and in many cases is actively built to harm you. So Luna is really emphasizing the importance of finding autistic community with like-minded people who could kind of provide a little bit of a buffer for that outside world. So what about the effects of masking? I said earlier that I was going to talk a little bit about the relationship between victimization and masking and the impact of masking on mental health. We know masking is related to poor mental health outcomes, so anxiety, depression, and suicidality in autistic people. And some research that I've done again with Kira and Rose, we've looked at the reasons that autistic people might mask and the kind of mechanisms that build up around masking. And masking is often argued to be a social strategy, so something we might use to blend in with neurotypical people in social situations. But for many autistic people, masking is a trauma response. It's driven by these experiences of victimization and feeling like you have to suppress aspects of yourself in order to stay safe in social situations. And this is summed up by one of our participants called Lydia in our victimization study, who said, it is a survival skill I've adapted and cannot turn off. It is a hard-won battle scar that deflects potential future pain. It is hypervigilance. I don't choose to do it. Sometimes I feel like I'm watching my behavior from outside myself, like I'm on autopilot. It's very exhausting nevertheless, and sometimes it even feels embarrassing and demoralizing. All of these are pseudonyms, by the way. These are not people's actual names. We've used pseudonyms for all of our participants. And in addition to that, Jasmine said, people pleasing was a massive issue. So the people pleasing has such a lasting effect. The fawning response, I think it's called. Politeness rules in my world, and I don't want to always be polite. Politeness isn't always called for. So Jasmine was highlighting how masking can relate to heightened compliance, how when we're trying to suppress aspects of ourselves, we might go to people pleasing in order to stay safe. So, okay, well, I'll just do what this person wants and then I'll be okay in this situation. And actually that can be really problematic for autistic people because it creates a bit of a vicious cycle by which you mask because of experiences of victimization, but then you comply as an aspect of masking. So you're fawning, you're complying with what people want. And this can lead to increased compliance, which can drive further victimization. So people then taking advantage of you because they know that you're not going to say no to them. And this is really especially concerning when we consider things like social skills interventions for autistic children, where we're teaching them to comply or conform to neurotypical expectations and ignore their own internal signals or their own coping mechanisms and take on things which are not native to them. It's teaching them to ignore those internal signals that they have. And in turn, that can start feeding into this cycle where people are ignoring what's going on, they're ignoring their own feelings, they're doing what people want, and then they're being victimized by people who take advantage. So that's not to say that learning non-native social rules can't be useful for people, but that's only if people want to learn non-native social rules. And we can think of this like learning another language or learning to speak neurotypical. So, you know, for instance, you might know that a friend of yours, I don't know, really likes the football. And so every time you see them, you might ask them about their favorite football team or, you know, the kind of fun they've had at football recently. And that might be something that you wouldn't necessarily be interested in, but you know they're interested in it. So you learn about it to talk to them. It's not that you're having to suppress aspects of your identity, that you're not then going to talk about your interests. It's not that their interests are superior to yours. It's just learning the kinds of things that other people might want to do too. So it's finding that balance and engaging with other people in a way that doesn't necessitate masking or having to kind of suppress aspects of ourselves. So what can we do to help? We know that people are having these experiences, that these negative outcomes are driven by stigma, by victimization, and that's leading to further masking. What can we do? Well, we really need to start at the root. Knowledge about autism and about autistic people isn't necessarily going to reduce stigma by itself, because as I said at the beginning, autistic people experience stigma, whether or not we know and whether or not other people know that we're autistic. We experience stigma because we're weird, because we don't fit in, because we don't conform to people's expectations of us. So teaching people about autism isn't going to reduce the kind of stigma that people have towards our differences. But what we can do is try and encourage others to make more room for different and weird and appreciate the kinds of differences that people bring, and also recognize that within ourselves as well. So working on some of that internalized stigma and recognizing the kind of the unique qualities that we have and how being weird isn't necessarily a bad thing. We can also help to recognize what abuse looks like, whether that's helping other people or, you know, helping ourselves to recognize what abuse looks like. So knowing what good relationships look like and teaching people, particularly young people, about that. How, you know, if a friend is, or if someone who you think is a friend is treating you in a particular way, how that's not okay and what to do and who you can go to if that happens. It's also really important that we find people like us where we feel safe to be ourselves. That's for the autistic people, whether it's people with shared interests, whether it's people who have kind of intersectional community associations. So one of the things that we found in our research was that a lot of autistic people who were also queer were saying that they wanted queer autistic spaces that they could be in, where they could feel like they could be themselves, both in terms of their sexuality or their gender, but also in terms of being autistic, and finding spaces where both of those things are okay was quite hard sometimes. And finally, we can try and minimize the need for masking and recognize the need for recovery. So that is time after we've been in social situations, which might be particularly draining or stressful, time to recover and to come down from that, and try and facilitate being in environments where we can be ourselves and be out about being ourselves, whether that's at school or at home with family, whether it's with good friends, that can just kind of minimize that stress we're under, and help lead to better mental health outcomes. So I'm going to stop there. I think I've done pretty well, sticking pretty much exactly to time. Thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, I'll keep an eye on the Q&A. Thank you all very much.
That was brilliant. Thanks, Amy. And now I'm going to pass it over to Gillian, who's going to talk for about 20 to 30 minutes also.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Amy. That was brilliant. A wonderful way to introduce quite a serious theme. I'm going to share my slides now in a moment, so just bear with me. Give me 1 second. This is always the way. Once we get into the flow of it, we'll be grand. There we go. Perfect. So I am going to be talking about the same theme, autism and mental health. And I think both of our presentations will really complement each other, and we'll be able to pretty much cover a huge range of topics between us. Again, this is the tip of the iceberg sort of a topic. So pretty much, yeah, autistic mental health. It's a difficult and potentially sore subject for some. So it's curious, going with the same message that Amy had around vulnerability and personal safety. Everybody is a very unique and precious individual. This is a general mental health talk, so we can only really give the general tips and tricks from our professions and what we've seen and what we've worked with and what we've personally experienced. There is no one size fits all, no matter who you are. That's just not going to happen. So if you're working with a healthcare provider already and you have an agreed plan that works for you, stick with that. What we're presenting on is hopefully just a bit of something to take away, reflect on, and think, what can we do? What can we do in the community, and what can we do to basically make more space for us to be seen, to be witnessed, and to be validated, and to have affirmative spaces where we can access better healthcare overall, mental health and overall healthcare. So just be mindful, because I have to say, when I was doing research, I've done quite a lot of research in the last few years on autism, and I'm still, despite what I do, I still get triggered. So just be careful of the content and what you might hear in the presentation, how this might impact you afterwards. I call myself a slow cooker. It takes a while for things to land. So I'd sit there and say, oh yeah, I'm fine. But then afterwards I'd feel a bit off. It just takes a while. So just to bring that to your attention, because when we look at mental health and we start talking about it and start processing and start looking at the history of autistic mental health, it's no wonder we have got statistically worse mental health than the general population. And I'll go into that a little bit. And this is what I'm talking about: personal safety. So if you need to tune out, and as Brendan said, this call will be available online. So if you need to tune out and dip back in another time, the whole thing is showing up as you and making this work for you in your way. So who might be even talking to you today? And this is not the Gillian Fagan show, but just to give you a bit of an insight into where I'm coming from, the perspective I'm bringing. I'm an autistic woman. I'm also multiply neurodivergent, which is great fun. A lot of inner conflict comes with that. I'm dyspraxic, an ADHD and autistic. I got diagnosed in adulthood, which presents its own mental health issues, because there's a relief and a sadness and a whole load of other range of emotions that go with that. And if it looks like I have a light here that's just doing its own thing. sensory input. I may end up turning that off. It just flickers sometimes. So I struggled a lot academically. I never did great in secondary school. I did brilliant in primary school, but I wasn't sure what I wanted, who I was. The whole idea of going into work, I had no idea. How could I decide what I wanted to do for the rest of my life? So I kind of took other people's advices, and people meant well, and they said, hey, if you're not quite sure, go do this line of work. And I did, and I worked for 20 years in a field that I really didn't enjoy, and I experienced severe burnout twice, which I now recognize as autistic burnout, because when I look at the issues that caused me to crash, it's quite curious. I have a history of being a poor friend, having abusive relationships. So it was in my own quest to understand and improve my own mental health that I went to therapy. And I have had varying experiences with the success of therapy. Thankfully, now that I've cultivated and grown what my needs are and become aware and tuned into what I need as an individual, I've been able to seek better supports, but it took a long time. So this idea, and I'm going to talk a little bit about self-awareness, it takes time. It really does. It's not just like you can wave the magic wand and suddenly know exactly what your needs are and what you want. And if you're a slow cooker like me, it could even take years. And I'm not saying that to put you off. I'm saying that because this screen that I'm sharing with you shows a snapshot of my life now. I really didn't think I'd be living this life. I now run, I run Gillian Fagan Consultancy. I run Under the Rainbow. I run AcoraTherapy. I run 3 businesses. I'm also on the board of 2 other companies. Well, the steering committee of the Association of Neurodiverse Therapists, and I'm on the board of the Anua Academy. If you had said to me 15 years ago, this is the life I could have been living, I wouldn't have believed you. Back then, my life was very, very, very different. So mental health, first and foremost, through my own discovery of my own mental health, I started studying human behavior. I started studying psychology, philosophy, and basically became a qualified psychotherapist. I have not stopped training in the last 10 years. Finally, I moved from a C student to an A student because I found something I loved. The insider joke, I found my special interest. My special interest, ironically, is understanding other people. That's my special interest. But through that, I've been able to completely transform my own life and really help support people in empowering themselves to do similar in their lives. And in the way I say I'm always studying, I recently, like this year, got a first class honours from Maynooth University in studying equality studies, focusing my studies on the neurodiversity movement and the changes that basically autistic people and people with fellow like other neurodiversities have made to the landscape for us in human rights, and paving the way for us to have more accessible, the same healthcare, the same job access as anybody. And it's a subject I'm very, very, very passionate about. So if my passion comes across, you can understand why. So that's kind of who I am and how I'm here talking about this. So now that that's the credentials out of the way, let's talk mental health. There's still such a stigma around what mental health is. It's not the absence of mental illness. Mental health really is the well-being of a person as a whole. That's your social well-being, your physical well-being, your emotional well-being, how you are doing generally, how your overall wellness is. And the World Health Organization defines mental health as a state of well-being where every individual realizes their own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, and is able to make a contribution to their community. So if you think that that's the definition of mental health by the World Health Organization, it might just change how we see mental health, because whether you like it or not, every single one of us has mental health. We all do. There is no such thing as somebody with no mental health. Some people might have better mental health than others, like physical health. So when we look that we all have mental health, autism is not a mental health problem. And I'm kind of really blue in the face saying this to professionals who are not neurodiverse themselves. But current evidence shows that up to 70% of autistic people experience severe mental health conditions. And to be honest, doing the line of work that I do, being a therapist, I've been working with autistic people 8 years now. as a therapist. So seeing what comes into the therapy room, my own journey with my own mental health, the studying that I've done in understanding mental health, it doesn't surprise me. There's emerging evidence as well that suggests exactly what Amy was talking about, that masking is an issue, and masking really doesn't help us when it comes to mental health. And yet we're being raised, especially those who are diagnosed later in life, to be a certain way, to fit in, to conform. So because of that, and I'm not getting into a gender discussion, not in this talk, that's perhaps a talk for another time. I don't really see gender as just the male and female, but statistically, let's just throw it out there for now. Autistic women and girls have much higher rates of mental health struggles than autistic boys and men, and yet autistic men have higher rates of addiction and suicide. So we do have a mental health issue, big time, and at least talks like this help us address it and do something about it. So why generally have autistics got poorer mental health? And this is where the self-care piece really does come into play. The way in which we perceive the world is slightly different perhaps to neurotypical people, but the way in which we are perceived is very different to neurotypical people. So here is a list, and this list is not necessarily limited to this. And I'm going to just read through this just for the accessibility perspective. So social conditioning. No matter who you are, we're told how to behave. You come out of a womb and you're told what words to say, like you're fed your foods, you're dressed in clothes that you should be wearing, you are sent to certain schools. When you're a very young child, your friends are nearly chosen for you. We are conditioned. That's the way we are. It's how we evolve. We are a species that thrives in community, but community can also harm us because it gives us this conditioning of how we should be. And if there's one word I could ban, it would be the word should. So we're told from very young, no, don't do that. No, do this, and how to be and how we should be. So we're socially conditioned. Later in life, that comes with a whole load of baggage. That isn't even your baggage, by the way, it's your community's. And I'm talking about not the community you choose, the community you're raised in. Stigma and discrimination, I don't need to kind of get into that. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. Lack of services and supports. Granted, there are improvements. There's still a huge absence of services and supports, and I can talk about that in a little bit. The resources for coping skills are mostly aimed at neurotypicals. You go and Google like how to immediately ground yourself, how to deal with disassociation, how to come down from a panic attack, all of these things, you're going to find the generic kind of Google says top 5 fits all. It doesn't really work for autistics. It doesn't really work for us. We have to find out our own way of self-regulating. And again, that brings its own challenges. There are so many myths about us. So many myths about us. That is probably one of the worst things for our mental health, is when you actually start reading and looking up like information about autism, not coming from somebody who is autistic or who's at least neurodiverse affirming. Not being understood, believed, or included. We've noticed that before society even told us we were different. We would have been different anyway as children. We would have not been picked perhaps for the sports teams. We would have experienced othering from a very young age, and most of us have been bullied, not even knowing why. And it's again, later in life, you look back and realize, sugar, yeah, there's the why. But that totally knocks your sense of self, leaves you with all kinds of confidence issues. Overwhelm. Life is overwhelming, full stop, in so many ways. And I could do an entire week's training on overwhelm, but it means something different to everybody. But that's another thing that impacts our mental health massively. Being othered, we absolutely suffer and struggle with minority stress. And there's such an overlap between autistic people and LGBT people, or autistic people and people with other disabilities. We're just othered left, right, and center. It's great fun. Sarcasm. Fatigue and burnout. I've experienced personally. I've worked with a lot of clients who have experienced it. And there's a whole load of fatigue and burnout. The masking is a big thing, the trying to fit in, the not being able to meet your needs because you don't even know what your needs are, the struggling to respond in a world of that's made for neurotypicals, finding your resources, your self-help books, and reading it and still not really getting anything out of it. Also, we tend to have a lot more compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Isolation and loneliness. I don't want to thank COVID for anything, but in the last year and a half, because my entire world has moved online, I've met the most amazing people. I really have. And it's because of going online, and it's because of COVID. And I have really finally connected with a sense of community with the neurodiverse squad. And it's been transformative for me personally. Too much empathy. The clients I work with, on my own experience, that is really more the case than no empathy or too little empathy. We struggle with existentialism. We struggle with compassion fatigue. We struggle with vicarious trauma. We struggle with trying to help our friends. Like Amy said, lending people money, being taken advantage of, being manipulated because we care, and we care too much, and we care to the point where we nearly self-sacrifice. Sensory input. One of the best things I ever did for myself was start to pay attention to what overwhelms and underwhelms me and develop this sensory profile about myself. It changes. I wish it was consistent. Life would be so much easier. And with COVID, it's changed again, because I find I have a much lower tolerance now for certain sensory stimulus that wouldn't have even bothered me before. I just can't do perfume at all anymore. A year and a half ago, I mightn't have even noticed certain perfumes. If you're multiply neurodivergent, like ADHD and autism, that's a bag of fun. You can have severe inner conflict that comes with that. I love the idea of a structure and routine, but I feel so claustrophobic in it. I self-sabotage when I do spend hours planning out my week. There's a lot of relationship hopelessness, victimization, as Amy talked about, and masking. The amount of us that want the fairy tale ending, or would like to fall in love, or would like someone to love us or accept us for who we are. The problem is finding that relationship, getting started in the relationship, going on dating apps, and already the masking begins to try and find a suitable partner or whatever else. The amount of clients, and me too, who presented with relationship hopelessness. Not feeling good enough. I've yet to meet a neurodiverse client where this is not an issue as well. And it's something I still struggle with. Not fitting in, identity confusion, poor sense of self. That's particularly present with late diagnosis as well. When you get late diagnosis or diagnosed in adulthood, talk about reframing your entire life, looking back and saying, that's why I was bullied. That's why I got fired from that job. That's why I didn't leave that abusive relationship. Great. The loss that comes with that and the anger that comes with that as well. There's a lot to process in being diagnosed later in life too. And then anxiety about having to conform, getting it wrong, other people, the not quite knowing what to say, to overshare, undershare, trying to read the room, the social skills that, where is the book, please? This concept, I'm a psychotherapist, this concept of accept and let go. If somebody could please hand me the instruction manual on how to let go, that would be awesome. But nearly every self-help book I've read has told me to let go. I have yet to figure out the how. So when you kind of look at, these are the things I've experienced coming into the therapy room and from my own studies. But when we look at the why we generally have poorer mental health, it's no wonder then we have issues like we struggle with anxiety, depression, intrusive thoughts, OCD, poor confidence, trauma, experiences of isolation, experiences of abuse. These are the main three: stress, depression, and anxiety. These are the main mental health issues. And they're the main across all of society and all people. If you do a little bit of digging and start looking into stress, depression, and anxiety specific to autistic people, the statistics are quite shocking. And there's a part of me that's nearly even reluctant to give the stats, and I'm finding myself nearly getting triggered. And this is why the self-care piece is so important. We do not have enough resources, even still in Ireland. We are nearly in breach of the rights, the human rights for people with disabilities. We are in breach of so many movements, and yet very little is being done. And COVID, yes, COVID happened, but a lot of the work that is being done to pave the way for autistic people is being done by autistic people, which is fantastic that we now have this huge movement around self-advocacy, but there's still not enough being done. And when you look at the waiting lists or how difficult it is to find somebody who gets autism to work with autism, it's a whole other world. So when we look at stress, everybody gets stressed. Everybody, no one's immune to stress, because stress is basically, the definition of stress is our brain's response to demand. Life is stressful. With certain autistic people, we don't like change. We don't like not knowing. I don't like not knowing. We don't like having to make adjustments to adapt to the world, especially if we've invested so much into structuring the day. So stress can suddenly overwhelm us. And this sense of losing control or not being in control or not knowing or not having the plan causes stress to go up. Now, I am generalizing, but overall that's the same for everybody. Given the way autistic brains are, we are a lot more prone to stress. And I believe our stress is 3 times the level of neurotypical people's stress. Stress is high anyway, but what stress can do to the body, it causes all of these hormones that kind of get locked in and are very bad for our physical health. And that's why the connection between mental and physical health, like it's, we may as well just be talking about health. Anxiety affects nearly half of autistic people, like as in anxiety disorder. I'm not talking about feeling anxious in a moment. I'm talking about anxiety disorder. Nearly half of autistic adults have an anxiety disorder. Now, when we start looking at the way the world works, who can blame us? But we have trouble accessing proper supports. And for the most part, what are we given for anxiety? Anti-anxiety tablets. They work. I've been on anti-anxieties. They work. But there are other resources out there. Wouldn't it be amazing if it was more accessible for us? When we have anxiety, there are all different kinds of anxiety: the social anxiety, performance anxiety, day-to-day anxiety, general anxiety, sensory anxiety as well. So even knowing what your sensory needs are can help you manage and regulate your anxiety, or being able to tune into when it flares, what triggers it, becoming self-aware around your anxiety triggers and knowing what your needs are and not being ashamed to meet them or take time out if that's what you need to do. Nearly 30% of autistic adults have depression, and depression seems to be more of a thing the older you get. So for autistic adults, the depression rates increase with age. One of the big issues as well for depression is some of the way we would communicate actually can cause depression, because it masks. People might not realize we're depressed. People might not realize that when we ask for help, we need help. Very few autistic people I know are good at asking for help, because we've just had to get on with things. We've learned how to conform rather than seek supports. So what can we do about this? This is a really simple and crude analogy. I find this very effective. I like metaphors personally. So me being the slow cooker, this is a stress bucket. If you can take a moment to tune in to how you are feeling and where your stress level is at the moment, and picture your body being the bucket. Generally, now this doesn't work with everybody. It really depends on imagination and visualization. But if you can think, if you were a bucket and the stress was the water in the bucket, where would that water level be right now? If you're able to tune into that and become aware of how stressed you are, it might surprise you to actually recognize, I feel the stress on my shoulders. Oh, wow, I feel the stress at the tip of my head, or no stress here. But if you can get into the habit of doing that on a daily basis, if you have the ability, the capacity to do this, it's a very simple and effective technique, because then you can realize, oh, my stress bucket's overflowing. What can I do today to mind myself to maybe reduce stress or avoid stress in this moment while I can cope? So let me just talk a little bit about the barriers that we experience as autistic people, the barriers to getting the right type of mental health care. Now, yes, things are changing. We have a lot of work to do. And unfortunately, because now the whole movement for mental health awareness has become autistic-led, we're taking our time, but we're getting there. So one of the main barriers I experienced was the lack of understanding by mental health professionals around what autism actually is. Communication difficulties, funnily enough, not by my autistic peers, more by, and I'm not making it an us and them, but more by my neurotypical peers, the communication barriers. I work with clients who are nonverbal. I work with clients who are deaf. I have found ways to make it work. I don't understand why it's an issue in some cases. There are ways for us to communicate. We communicate verbally so little anyway, and it's about tuning into all of the different communication styles to be able to meet those needs. Sensory sensitivities. I joined in a discussion on Twitter the other day about, do we have candles in the therapy room? It's a big no for me. Big no for me. Smells in a therapy room put me off going. And when I was training, the college I was in had those sticks, to the diffuser scented sticks in the training room. And I'd have to take them out of the room, put them in a different room. But for the first 2 hours, I couldn't take in any of the information because I was trying to breathe shallowly through my, like just very shallowly through my nose because of the nausea of the smell in the room. So little things like that, sensory sensitivities, when you consider how much something like a smell or a light or having a way of having therapy where it doesn't have to be face-to-face or eye contact, providing colouring books, putting the chairs at a different angles, even sitting side by side in an outside of COVID world. There are many ways that we can work around sensory sensitivities, and yet it's still a barrier. There's no need for this to be a barrier. The collaboration between in healthcare all round, I would love to see a world where mental health is in contact with your GP, is in contact with the disability service, is in contact with social welfare, is in contact with your employer, is in contact with social justice or housing. Imagine if all of these departments talk to each other, what a wonderful world it would be. There's still a barrier in that because we have to constantly repeat ourselves, self-advocate, find someone, maybe a key worker on our behalf, to do the communication for us. I personally don't like paperwork. It's exhausting. Could you imagine if there was just something that made that more accessible? Poor understanding in autism. I have had this experience, sadly, where my autism has been almost, oh, that explains everything. No, I also have anxiety and it's a separate thing. I also have trauma, that's a separate thing. I also have imposter syndrome, that's a separate thing. To kind of label everything as autism means the other parts aren't being addressed. And it's quite a dismissive ableist approach in some mental health care areas. Granted, I am seeing improvements, massive improvements, but only in the last couple of years. And hopefully those improvements will still happen. Now, I know from speaking with parents that they will disagree, and I respect that. I found as an adult trying to seek diagnosis and supports that a lot of the resources were geared towards children. There seems to be a heavy emphasis on providing supports for children, which I completely do understand, but in doing so, there are a lack of supports for adults. And when I was seeking them, and when I spoke to my own care team, let's just put it that way, the general gist I got was, you've coped so well so far, why would you want to seek diagnosis? Why would you want to seek supports? Not the right thing to say. So I find our personal autonomy is not really taken seriously. People think you're autistic and nearly override but when I explain, well, hang on, I run so many businesses, I'm doing okay, people will listen, but not because of my autism, because, and that's wrong. We need to have more embracing a culture of personal autonomy, this idea of inviting people to speak up. So that's just a little bit about the barriers. So self-care, very important, very, 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 very important. I cannot stress how important self-care is, not just around developing the sense of personal autonomy, but to kind of fall in love with yourself. If you can find what works to care and look after and nourish and nurture yourself, that's amazing. We all need help. We do need community, but we also owe it to ourselves to show up for us and try to meet our own needs in the ways that we're able to. So self-care improves your well-being and your resilience, your psychological immune system, which I don't have there. We have a psychological immune system the same way we have a physical immune system. Stress management. Remember that old thing called stress? Yeah, self-care will help with that. Better relationships, because we find our voice. We're able to say no, we're able to have boundaries, or we're able to ask for help. Overall success depends on what that looks like, okay? Healthier and happier life, that is true. That is so true, because when we are managing our stress levels, when we are aware of our triggers and our limits for anxiety, when we are able to seek supports when we need them in a neurodiversity way, it does reduce our overall stress hormones, which overall actually makes us healthier. Self-regulation, I've mentioned personal autonomy as well. The ability to self-regulate, it's a gift. It's incredible. It's a work in progress for life, though. So self-care. Now, this is not your overall one-size-fits-all self-care. Trust me. This is a little bit of self-care suggestions on what might work for an autistic person, because it is different. Walks in nature. I could spend a day talking to you about why that's a huge benefit, not just for everybody, but specifically for autistics. It boosts hormones that we have that actually almost mimic antidepressants. If you have a walk, connect with nature, you boost your serotonin levels, you boost your endorphins, you can boost your oxytocin levels, especially if you take off your shoes and walk barefoot. But again, there's a lot of sensory things that go with walks in nature, but it's a really good way to tune into what your sensory needs are. I have a very strong light sensitivity. I prefer walking when the sun is not blinding me because it causes all other kind of impacts. To value yourself, you are a precious and unique human being. No matter what you're feeling about yourself right now, you have something to offer to this conversation. You have something that you can do for yourself. You can provide amazing value on this planet. And to value yourself, we're told constantly how we should be. It erodes our sense of self. To take a step away from the shoulds and the society and just check in, actually, I'm all right. When I'm not listening to other people, it turns out I like myself. Know your strengths. There are a lot of quizzes out there that can help you get into what your strengths are, but there are some superb occupational therapists who can also work on a strengths-based approach. Set up flow states. I found that when I was studying, I couldn't believe I got a first class honors, and I'm not saying that to gloat. I genuinely couldn't believe it. I didn't expect to. But when I was studying, I set up a flow state. I had my stims here. I had my music here. I'd made a specific playlist. I probably put more time into the playlist than studying. That's not quite true, almost true. But I created a flow state environment, even in terms of how my water was there. So I didn't have to leave the room or break that flow. It's very rare I get into a complete flow state, but I can set up an environment to do that. And you can do the same if it's a case that you need to work on a project or get something done. I'm great at procrastinating. So flow state was an incredible learning thing for me, and it's transformed how I go about my work. And that also includes creating your environment. You can set up an environment that meets your sensory requirements and gives you the right kind of stimulus without being overwhelming. Connect with community. Even Amy said that, the importance of finding other people like you. I used to joke that in life I was waiting for the mothership. I really believed, and Mom, if you're watching, I know we've talked about this, I'm sorry. I really believed I'd been switched in the hospital at birth with another baby. I really believed I was an alien in the human body. This idea of not fitting in. Once I began to connect with community, find other people like me, the difference in my overall sense of self has been profound. STEM preferences. I find that I go through phases with STEMs where almost year on year, I will hate the thing that last year I got the most pleasure from. And that's okay. But to allow yourself to seek out new stims or try new things, or like your STEM preferences can really enhance how your brain works. There's a whole load of research, academic research, science research that shows how STEMing can actually benefit everybody. And yet there's still this sit on your hands mentality. I grew up with sit on your hands being said to me all day, every day in school. That's all I remember from school, sit on your hands. I can't remember much else. I learned that lesson. So to communicate in your way, I think that's very important. And it's exactly what Amy was saying as well, learning the language, learning how to express and communicating in your way, and finding a place that's valid and will accept your style of communication and what works for you. And that's the great thing about connecting with community. Boundaries. conversation for another time, a very important one. If you're not sure about your boundaries, I'll have a very simple little check-in in a sec, I'll show you. Self-regulation. Yeah, unfortunately, it is our job to self-regulate. Not always able to. We get overwhelmed, life happens, stress happens, anxiety happens, people happen. Where it is possible to learn the tools to self-regulate can really transform your mental health. It is a tough thing to do. It's a life's work. But even the concept of self-regulation, to start thinking about noticing that stress bucket. When do I feel overwhelmed? When do things start to flare up? Overwhelm recognition. If I'd have learned that before I got to 30, God only knows how my life would have turned out. But overwhelm recognition, again, have it now. I'm in my 40s. But if I had to start working on these things sooner, and this is why I really think when it comes to self-care, particularly for autistics, it's different. It's different to your bubble baths and chocolate or whatever self-care kind of buzzwords are of the moment. Time out. We all need time out. Need to decompress, need to recharge, need to socially say no. But knowing where the boundary is and not feeling obliged. And that can be very difficult, especially if you work for yourself. Therapy. Yeah, I'm going to talk about that in a second. Step forward and step back. If you need permission, I'm giving it to you. Sometimes we don't realize when to step forward or when to step back. Knowing what your needs are around this, again, can really, really make a difference between good mental health day and bad mental health day. Sometimes it really takes a lot for us to step forward. And sometimes we need to also step back. And I can sometimes go on like banging a drum, especially if I'm on a cause or on a mission. And sometimes I have to also know when to step back and let other people step forward. Time traveling. I'm a time traveler. And I think anybody who has ever had anxiety is definitely a time traveler. It's like my brain, now I've trained it, and you can, but my brain defaults to two modes where I think about the past, think about what I shoulda, woulda, coulda done, what I should have said, what I maybe could have said, what other people thought, the regrets of, oh, now I have to live with the consequence of what did they think of when I said this. Living in the past doesn't do anybody any good. Or if I'm not in past state, I'm in future state. What might happen? What will they think? What will I wear? What will it be? The anxieties around what if. And one thing I have learned from life is nothing goes to plan. But knowing that actually saves me a lot of future time travel. I've become a lot more laid back now, probably too laid back, but it's a lot nicer than trying to plan for absolutely everything and still having it not work out. So just to take on board, are you a time traveler? And if so, is there anything that you can do about it? The idea of being in the present, again, perhaps talk for another time. Now, overwhelm. This, I actually really love this image. I really do. I don't know why, but it speaks to me on so many levels. This dead battery. Well, maybe worn out or passed out or partied out battery. Every time I see it, I smile, okay? But this idea of a battery, what charges your battery and what drains it? We do so much for other people. We do so much of going through the motions. We do so much that just takes away our energy. And if we're not putting energy back into that battery or charging ourselves again, we're depleted. And yet we commit to things and yet we still say yes. And then we don't show up or we ghost people or we can't respond to texts because we're absolutely running on empty. So the stress bucket and this battery, they're the same sort of concept of that self-check-in and the ability to develop that self-regulation. So if you are able to even just take away the idea of a battery, what charges you and what drains you? It's the self-awareness. We're told, as Amy said, we're told who we are. Other people, and we internalize this sense of, oh, you're not good enough. We're told, oh, why can't you do that? It's such a simple thing. So-and-so was able to do that. Oh, our sense of self comes from other people. We have a social identity, which other people tell us who we are. if you actually like start breaking that down and deconstructing all of the messages the world has given you that you've internalized and connecting with that core sense of you, what words would you use to describe yourself? Like, how amazing would it be to just highlight what's unique about you and is not something other people have used to describe you? The amount of us that don't even know who we are, genuinely, and like completely, that was me all through my 20s. I kept going for promotion, because isn't that what people did? I got engaged because isn't that what people did? I bought a house because isn't that what people did? The only regret I have in my life is buying that house. Having that self-awareness can absolutely lead to different decisions in your life, very different decisions where you have that personal autonomy. So it's being mindful of you and not what other people expect, and your own limits and your own stressors. And then you can take appropriate action to maybe meet your own needs. Even the question, what are my needs? What needs do I have as an individual? It's quite profound. And I only saw this quote today on Twitter and I loved it. And I've studied Carl Rogers quite a bit. My whole therapy practice is based around what's called person-centered, well, other bits thrown in. But I love this, and I wish more therapists would have this approach. This idea that therapists have when they go into the world of like being a therapist is, how can I treat or cure or change the person? Imagine, I see this actually as a neuroaffirmative approach to therapy. How can I provide a relationship which this person may use for their own personal growth? Now, the quote is his, let's say there. I loved that quote. And I think, yeah, how can we have that relationship with ourselves for personal growth instead of as mental health professionals trying to cure or treat? So I just thought I'd finish on this slide because people always kind of want to know, why do autistic people go to therapy? The same reason that anyone goes to therapy. However, we go in for the same reasons that most people go to therapy. So we're looking for therapists who work with, let's say, trauma. Most therapists work with trauma. We're looking for therapists who work with, let me pick another one, imposter syndrome. You're going to get a therapist who works with those things without having a neurodiversity approach or even an awareness, or being, in an ideal world, being neurodiverse themselves. They're going to approach the work from a certain framework. And a lot of clients I work with, and I'm sure I definitely know from, I've been on some of Kieran's talks, that it's a similar experience across the board. Therapy can actually damage us if we don't find a therapist who can meet us where we're at, allow for us to be ourselves, and is curious about how we work, because we're all different. As the saying goes, you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. So if you are beginning to seek mental health supports, and I'm not even saying psychotherapy, there's a fantastic, now, there's only actually one therapist and two pending in Ireland that are going onto this website. There's a directory, the ANDT, which is the Association of Neurodiverse Therapists. So we're therapists who are autistic or have other neurodiversities. There are also thriving autistics. And again, neurodiverse people who are mental health professionals who can help neurodiverse people. So there's growing services out there. We still have a way to go. Under the Rainbow, and I'm not, but I don't actually deal with the therapy centre Under the Rainbow anymore. I'm too busy doing other stuff. Under the Rainbow, 2/3 of our therapists are neurodiverse, more than half being autistic. I'm sure you've all heard of Owen Stevens as well. So there are beginning to become more and more visible autistic therapists. And I remember when I got my diagnosis, another therapist said to me, "Oh, whatever you do, don't come out. That would be career suicide." No way am I doing that. That's me banging my drum and paving forward and ignoring other people. So why do autistic people come to therapy? Because we have poor mental health in the general population. We could do with supports, we could do with therapy. However, the difference between getting further traumatized and actually working on empowering yourself, like if you can find somebody who has a neurodiversity affirmative approach, genuinely it can make all the difference, and it is worth spending that extra time doing a bit of research, even if it means you're working with somebody online. A neurodiversity affirmative therapist will kind of let you do therapy in your way. because it's about setting up the sensory environment that actually supports you rather than drains you. And again, that will charge your battery rather than take it away. So that's pretty much, I always go over. Time regulation and me is not a thing. So thank you very much. Any questions? I'll be happy to